Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I'm really excited to bring the conversation I had with David Veevers. David is an award-winning historian and lecturer in early modern history at University of Bangor. He has his PhD from the University of Kent, specifically in the British Empire, and he is also the author of the latest book, The Great Defiance: How the World Took on the British Empire. And that is what we talk about in this conversation. We start the conversation by talking about just generally what a lot of his book is about, which is why do we ignore some parts of history in the story of the British Empire and usually just kind of this good versus evil, the British Empire always comes out on top kind of thing. And so we talk about some of these other stories that don't get talked about as much as he does in his book. And we talk about some of the resistance that people have to telling other stories, a part of the British Empire. We talk about where he starts in the book, the Irish resistance to the British Empire. We talk about a good bit how the British colonized North America and some of the ideas behind the interactions with Native peoples. We spent a good amount of time in this part of the conversation, and I was really, 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 really happy with how we dialogued about this. In the conversation you'll hear, I'm doing a lot of playing the kind of conduit to many types of objections and many types of claims that people make about talking about these types of stories. And it was really, really nice to hear him spell it all out and why a lot of these ideas don't make sense or they don't fit both factually and morally. And so it was just fantastic to have that part of the conversation here. We move over to Asia. We talk about the British Empire and working with other empires in Asia and what that looked like. We talk about some of the resistance the British Empire met in various African countries. And then we end by talking about this: how do we have this full picture of how we remember the British Empire, most accurately? David is so wonderful. He's got this really, really wonderful way of looking at, British history, and I think an all-important one that many people are starting to do, where it's like, how do we incorporate all these stories? He was an absolute delight to have on the podcast. I really, really enjoyed this conversation, and so I hope folks get out there and get his book. As always, you can listen to this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. It's also on YouTube, so get over there, subscribe, follow, and share widely. And so now I bring you David Veevers. I'm here with David Veevers. David, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm looking forward to talking with you.
Thanks for having me. Very exciting. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, of course, absolutely. You have written a wonderful book. It's called The Great Defiance: How the World Took on the British Empire, and it's wonderful. It's a history most often don't get, and you traverse basically lots of different continents here. Before we get into the book, just tell us kind of a thumbnail sketch of who you are, what your background's in professionally, and what you're currently thinking about and up to.
Yeah, well, thank you again. So I'm a lecturer in early modern history at the University of Bangor in Wales, here in the UK. And I do my research mostly on the British Empire, specialisms in the East India Company, which was the sort of beginning of the British Empire in places like India and the rest of Asia. This is my second book, previous book on the origins of the British Empire in Asia with Cambridge University Press. And so The Great Defiance is the first book I've written for a wider audience. So it's not just for students and professors. Instead, rather, it's for non-specialists, and it should be available in all good bookshops. And hopefully, I'm working on next book, which may or may not be a follow-up, taking the story into the Victorian period, the 19th and early 20th centuries, when it's really the height of the British Empire, and we see these maps of imperial pink splashed everywhere, and the empire upon which the sun never set. But even then, there are stories of indigenous and non-European power. So that's something exciting. That's kind of beyond my particular area. So I'm really enjoying getting into all that. I feel like a student again, almost.
I must ask. I mean, I'm sure you have lots of thoughts about the coronation, and you have a new king over there now.
No, I don't have any thoughts. Yes, I do have
I
thoughts.
know
Yes.
some people are kind of divided on it. Some people like the tradition and whatever, but then other people are very anti-monarchy. And so yeah, I mean it's an interesting time, I guess. You guys are in a moment of transition.
It's a really interesting time because it's been an interesting time around this particular topic anyway, with Black Lives Matter, and in the UK toppling of slave trading statues, and then with the coronation, it's forcing us to have these conversations about the study of the British Empire as a well-established academic discipline, and people have been publishing on it ever since the British Empire was constructed, but it's been given a real public spotlight. And so the coronation is another example where it's great for people like me who see British Empire in the news and people talking about it on TV, but it's also a very contested history, especially for not just British people, but people around the world, and who are living in parts of what we call the Commonwealth, or even in former colonies, and that it's quite a raw topic. And so I think the coronation couldn't escape being tangled up with that wider debate about the legacies of the British Empire. So yes, there are thoughts there.
Well, as a former colonist, I guess, over here across the pond, I don't have too many opinions about it. I think I'm somewhere in between, which doesn't really help anything. But I think traditions are really good and helpful. But I also think that having a royalty just feels pretty antiquated at this point.
It's interesting because we say it's a tradition, but then you think about coronation. The last one was 70 years ago, and so it's almost we regurgitate these traditions, but actually for us, it's all very new as well in a way.
Right.
And so it's, what does a coronation in the 21st century look like? And oh dear, it looks very much like it used to. And what does that mean about the future of the monarchy? So it's really interesting.
It's very, very interesting. But yeah, I am a little sympathetic to people that are kind of resistant to it. I mean, I probably, if I lived in the UK, I probably would be too. It's a lot of money goes to it.
Well, I mean, if you think about 200 million on a coronation during a cost of living crisis, that's hard for anyone to stomach.
Yes.
So let's
practically it doesn't feel great at the very least. Okay. So I guess tell us about the book. I mean, we'll talk about different types of periods, I guess, in the empire. But I guess people have this image of the British Empire as being great and commanding for so long, even as you mentioned, kind of at the start, even up until the 20th century and 21st century, I guess. Why do we have, I guess, this standard view, and why have we ignored other sides of that story? Is it just because whoever's the winner or whoever's triumphant, they kind of write the story? Or why do we not talk about that story from other perspectives, from people like former colonies or the people in the Commonwealth or indigenous groups? Why have we neglected that part of the story?
I mean that's such a important but big question. I think there's just so many different aspects to it. I mean, I think yes, you're right. I think it's that somewhat cliche of the victors write history, and so a lot of the archival sources that have come down to us are those written by white Europeans, and that has given us a very narrow view of the emergence and expansion of the British Empire and the way it was maintained, and even in its decline and its in decolonization at the end. These were documents that were being produced by, but also preserved by, British colonial officials. And so what is preserved and what isn't preserved is left off with half a picture. And a very famous example is Kenya with the Mau Mau rebellion, and we know a lot of documents were destroyed and a lot were classified and have only recently come to light. So and so in the acquisition of archives, what documents have been preserved, and then what ones haven't, but also the perspective of those recording events in the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries are from a colonial point of view. So I think that's the kind of very obvious answer to it. But I think there's also a very modern reason why we don't often talk about the kind of other, from the perspective of non-Europeans and indigenous people, and for looking at the kind of grislier aspects of the British Empire. And that modern one is that the story of the British Empire has become so intimately bound up with British and European identity. We're not talking, Britain wasn't particular to have an empire to the British. Most European countries had, if not a full-on empire, then some kind of overseas colonial presence. Even countries like Denmark and Sweden. And I think that the legacies of the European empires have become part of European identity. And so, for the case of Britain, which is what I specialize in, to challenge rather kind of sacrosanct narratives of the contribution Britain made to the modern world, English language, democracy, industrialization, the rule of law. I'm going to put that in speech quotes there. Is to challenge the supposed good that Britain should be proud of its history. And again, that's not particular to Britain. In the United States, for example, it's a highly contested idea about history and how we should consume it, whether it should be there to reinforce our sense of identity and patriotism, or whether we should treat history as we treat many disciplines, as something to be scrutinized and to be approached critically and to be understood rather than celebrated. And so for people in today in the UK, I think that to perhaps suggest the British Empire was a bad thing, or certainly that it led to large-scale loss of life, the displacement of people, their disenfranchisement, their exploitation, is to live up to a very difficult truth to swallow, which is that we're not. History is not is not looking back and celebrating. It can also be like contemporary and like today, a very complex place full of good and bad. And so that's difficult when identities become so entrenched, and we've considered the British Empire for so long to be such a force for good, and in some ways rehabilitated by its role in the Second World War, when Britain and the Empire stood alone against Nazi Germany. That's a kind of fantastic rehabilitation story. And therefore, if you're challenging, the British Empire's history, in a way, you challenge that narrative of, defeating Nazism and contributing to, the modern world through, the United Nations and things like that. So I think it's become so contested and so politicized because you're challenging people's sense of identity. And so, yes, it comes from that skewed perspective of the archives and the documents that have been handed down from a British perspective. But it's also about, understanding the legacies and what that means for us and our history today. So I think that it mostly, and especially when we talk about it in the public sphere, politicians or on TV or journalists, that they tend to reinforce and latch on to those positive narratives, and those that in some way trying to become more critical and show the bad of the British Empire somehow are unpatriotic, or are, to use contemporary derogatory phrases such as, woke and so, that's where the contention lies. And I think that despite the fact that as historians, we've been looking at the bad side of empire for 5 decades, there's a misconception that this is a new thing historians are doing, when it's not. It's got a very long history. So I think that we have, outside of academia, I think we have a real challenge on our hands to get people to talk honestly and critically about the history of empire. Empires are constructs of coercion and control and exploitation. They're not, consensual constructs of collaboration and participation. That would not be an empire. That would be something else, a confederation or a state. And so, if we take our starting point for that, of course, the history of empires will be full of bloodshed and and coercion and violence. There's nothing wrong with admitting that, and it doesn't necessarily prevent you from saying that Britain did good things and the empire in defeating Nazi Germany in the 20th century or even in the 19th century. But I think that's the big challenge we've got on our hands today as historians of empire.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. One of the things that attracted me to your book was just that. Was one of the things is we get this. We get when you learn things in primary or even secondary schooling, you have this sort of kind of cohesive narrative of, okay, this is what happened, right? Here's the main story, right? Somebody begat somebody, or somebody conquered somebody, or somebody, whatever. And I think you say throughout the book, those things aren't necessarily inaccurate. It's just the fact that we've neglected other stories in that period. And I think that there's obviously, I think, probably with many historians I've talked to here, there's a kind of push pull of this kind of, not writing history, but a type of, or this revisionist history, but that there's, what does history look like when you have multiple perspectives or points of view there? Well, yes, there's many wonderful things about the British Empire. As you're mentioning, a clear example is, um, you know, uh, a critical, key, essential role of defeating, Nazis in World War II. That's wonderful. Um, and it's an interesting thing, though. A couple years, past couple years, some people said, well, maybe we don't like Churchill anymore because he was a racist and a bigot. And it's like, well, yes, but two things are true at the same time, right? And I think
Yeah.
that's hard for people to kind of sit with, where it's like, well, at the time, that probably wasn't too abnormal, or wasn't frowned upon. Whether the moral aspects of it are obviously wrong in any period, but I think that there is something about knowing things in context, and also saying, like, yeah, we can condemn him for that, but we can also prop him up for making sure that England wasn't run over by Nazi Germany. So I think it's for most people. I mean, people are complicated, things are complicated, and it can be really hard for people to hold two things in their head at once. And so one of the things that's really wonderful about your book is you're basically doing that, is saying, well, you don't have to take away all the stuff about the British Empire, but you do have to understand, here are some other stories, here are some ways people resisted this, and both can be true at the same time. And both,
Yeah.
we can hold both things in our head at the same time. Is that right? Is that kind of the tenor of what
Yeah,
you're
I
getting
think
at?
so. To a degree, I think we have to be somewhat careful of, what, particular to the British Empire, this debate that's emerged that, is called the balance sheet approach,
Mm.
where the good invalidates the bad. And that's
Yeah.
a line, sadly, some not really historians and theologians and political economists and very history adjacent fields, but not historians, have taken that, it's sort of like, oh yeah, famine bad, but hey, cricket. And it's kind of like, well, those two don't cancel each other out.
Right.
Terrible, political constructs like empires, can, produce positive things, but I think we still need to understand them in the framework of, that's rarely do they go out of their way to do nice things. So even if you think about another one that's, for reference is railways, and look at the railways, but railways were never constructed for the people of India, for example. They were constructed to move British troops around and to export raw materials better. Incidentally, yes, it improved people's lives and helped to an extent economic growth. But I think we always must take our understanding of that. And so, Churchill is a really good example because, there's been I think a welcome revisionist approach to Churchill, understanding him within his context of that he's an arch imperialist. Churchill, he was there at in Sudan at the Battle of Omdurman, where as a war correspondent, as 12,000 Mahdist Sudanese people were mowed down by Gatling guns, and he was in South Africa in the Boer War and on the northwest frontier in India. He's a product of the British Empire, and so his approach to the Second World War was, and if you read his speeches or listen to his speeches, he always invokes it's not Britain, it's the British Empire, Britain and the Empire against Nazi Germany. So you can see this as he wants to preserve the empire, and a part of his strategy against the Nazis was to invoke that. But that doesn't necessarily invalidate that he helped Britain defeat Nazi Germany,
Mm-hmm.
like the way it should invalidate that the Soviet Union helped defeat Nazi Germany. But we wouldn't allow that to rehabilitate the Soviet Union as a political entity at that time.
Right.
But putting it back to the book, I guess, is, yeah, you're right. It's about saying that there are these, a multitude of stories, and that if you shed light on them and you bring those to the fore, you're not losing any of those traditional narratives of the British Empire. You're simply just making a more comprehensive picture. As in any particular, even today, any event, there are, but where there's more than a single person involved, there will be multiple perspectives, and which perspective is right or wrong in a way doesn't matter. You're just telling a fuller story.
Yeah, it's funny though, because people, I'm sure maybe you've gotten some of this. I've talked to other folks with history here in the United States, post 1776, that people really resist that. It's almost like you're changing their bedtime stories almost. Like,
That's
no,
right.
no, you
Yeah.
can't. What? No. Oh God. Now we got to talk about all of this, and like, what are you doing? Like,
Yeah.
and like, that's not true, or you're trying to moralize history. People get really animated about this, and I guess I guess I could understand some of it. I mean, I'm sure there's bad faith actors out there that are really trying to change things, or spread inaccuracies. But I don't really understand, aside from I think what you're saying, the identity piece or the familiarity of it. I don't really understand why people have resistance to hearing things that have. I mean, what do you, just, I guess, briefly here, what do you think of that resistance?
Yeah, I do. I know what you mean, because I came to my enjoyment of history during my undergraduate, and then my interest in the British Empire through, what we call boys' own stories, those fantastic stories of imperial heroes and their kind of adventures, and I found that all very exciting. And then when I studied history and then did research in the British Empire, and okay, I know that, well, that's a fantasy, and that's a that's incorrect. These are not heroes running around having adventures. They're imperialists. As part of an agenda to expand the British Empire. But that didn't change. In fact, that deepened my interest in the history. I found out a far more complex and fascinating story. So maybe that people, like you said, they, do we resist overly complex understandings of things? Is it the simplicity of these traditional narratives, good versus bad, and modern progress over uncivilized, that people cherish because they're easy explanations for understanding not just their own history and their identity and their place in the world today. And then when you complicate that story, then you force them to have a kind of reckoning that traditional attitudes that spin out of those simplistic histories are no longer sort of able to cling on to and to deploy. And I think people, like when we look at ourselves, our behavior, and we don't really want to have a reckoning, and we resist that, and because we want to cling to this idea, that certain narratives we have about ourselves. So I think anything that forces us to be more introspective and to understand the nuances and the complexities of our history, and therefore our identity and how we understand the world. That's, I think, there's a certain section of society, and I think in a way we may overblow this. I think more people than not welcome revisionist histories and welcome introspections about society. I think that's probably more the case, but there does seem to be a vocal crowd of people that don't want that to be true. And I wonder whether it's the simplicity that they enjoy. And unfortunately, that's what good education does. It helps us to leave those simplistic, almost like you said, bedtime stories behind. And this is the real world, and real world things are complex, and you can't just say this is the right way. There are multiple different stories and opinions and perspectives, and we have to accommodate them. And if we don't in life, then we don't establish good relationships or good understandings of people and places and events. And I think that to embrace that and to abandon those simple childhood stories is maturing, it's growing. And I think that good scholarship forces uneducated or non-specialist readers to hopefully do that. And that wasn't what I thought about the British Empire, but this is just as interesting and just as meaningful, hopefully.
Yeah, no, I agree with everything you're saying there, and I think that's what's important. So so I should say the period you focus on is 1500 to 1800, and you
Mm.
start with the Irish. The Irish have obviously a long history of various conflicts. And you talk about during this period about they fought back against the advances of colonialism from Elizabeth the First. Um, I guess one one question I have here is, so we kind of know with a lot of these stories, but I guess with the Irish in particular, we know the end of the story here, right? We know that what ends up happening. Why did you decide to take the snapshot from this period of the resistance of the Irish against of the British Empire at this time, and how they were able to initially have some resistance, uh, and why that's important for the story, even if there is eventual colonization? Why is that part of the story for them in particular instructive?
Yeah, I think that I mean, this is something I did consciously because in the histories of the British Empire and of Britain from this period, we often just skip past Ireland. Ireland is our nearest neighbour, and what happens very early on, Ireland is turned into a kingdom, and therefore becomes almost part of domestic English history. And so we fold it into that, like we do Wales and then later Scotland, and yet long before it is completely colonized and conquered and governed as another realm of the British monarchs. It's not. It's a different country, one that
Yeah.
the English really, or I should say Anglo-Normans, have been attempting to conquer almost immediately the moment after the Norman invasion. And so even from the 12th century onwards, Ireland, the English had tried to colonize Ireland and struggled to do so. And 400 years later, it's had little success. And so in many histories of Britain, that's just the island is just ignored. And yet, I think what we see Ireland is at the moment when the English are striking out across the world, into the Mediterranean, across the Atlantic to the Americas and the Caribbean, down the west coast of Africa, and eventually into the Indian Ocean and beyond. At the very same time, the English are grappling with perhaps their biggest struggle. Ireland, and when we think of the Elizabethan period, we think of the war against Philip II of Spain and the Spanish Armadas, but actually the colonization of Ireland, or the struggle to colonize Ireland, I should say, at this time, has consumed far more lives and treasure than all of English foreign policy and colonial adventures pretty much combined. And so it was really interesting for me to take the starting point of the story of the British Empire, not from a period of striking out and starting to colonize, but actually already involved in this sort of colonial quagmire in which it was failing as much as it was succeeding. And so for me, that's a fantastic point if we want to shed light on the resistance to the British Empire, is that at the very beginning, it was already involved in a centuries-long process, and it becomes almost like a laboratory for English colonialism elsewhere. So the approaches the English take, the sort of resistance they encounter, their response to that, we see that then play out elsewhere in North America, the Caribbean, and wherever there's large-scale colonization. And yeah, it's not a linear narrative of English success. So quite the contrary. It's very up, down, and to the point where England's almost completely conquered Ireland. Then suddenly this major 9 Years' War breaks out, and it looks as though English presence is going to entirely evaporate, and they're going to be pushed back across the Irish Sea. And that drags on for years and years. But even then, once political independence of the Irish lords are crushed, you've got decades of failure to really occupy Ireland on any kind of significant scale, or to make it profitable, or even to which was one of the key aims of the English, is to try and convert the Irish culturally and religiously. That's a complete failure. So I thought a great point to start a story that we traditionally think of as a relentless rise and a triumphant narrative is to start with that failure, and that the strategies that they are attempting to adopt in Ireland are those that just show that actually the point that we start with the English story is one of weakness and one of strength in the non-European or indigenous world. And so I thought that really was a good way to kick off a story that really reverses the dynamic that we often associate with the rise of the British Empire.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I didn't. Again, I know various points of the Irish history, and they definitely resist a lot of with each other and with other nations, and so I think it was a good bit of the story to kind of show that. I would agree.
And
So
what I also said, I'm sorry, Trent,
yeah.
what I thought is kind of obscene situations, because Ireland is, our neighbour, and obviously still Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom, and therefore our histories are intimately bound up with one another. Sure. There is such little Irish history taught in schools in the UK. We know it's not present in at high school level or college level. The amount of university courses on Irish history are minuscule. There's a handful, and I just think
it gets subsumed under like United Kingdom British history, right?
Absolutely,
yeah.
It becomes domesticated. And
is that true in Wales as well? Or is that different?
Yes, no, that's not different. What I would say is within Wales itself, there's been a big push in recent decades for Welsh history to be studied on its own. And so I teach at the University of Bangor, where that's a very vibrant part of the teaching and the scholarship done there. So, but across the rest of the United Kingdom, it's it's part of the Tudors, for example, or the Plantagenets. So, and when. And I think, but what's most important about Ireland is that, unlike Wales, for example, Ireland eventually regains, or most of Ireland, I should say, regains its independence, and has now an independent history. And I think that made that even more boggling to me. Whereas Wales remains part of the United Kingdom, or I should say, the Kingdom of England and Wales, and it kind of makes sense that that's more domesticated in terms of its history. But for Ireland, no, that doesn't even make sense. So for me, it was also like, let's start in a completely unfamiliar place, but one that should be, that should not be unfamiliar. It should be, we should all know this history. But even I, a historian of early modern colonialism, I knew a fair bit about it. But the more I researched and wrote about it, I just thought it was really the epic of one of the big epic stories of the early British Empire.
Yeah. So we'll move across the pond here in the former colonies, the United States. I guess there's a few themes here. You talk about Raleigh, you talk about Gilbert, you talk about their greed, and I guess generally for them and for other folks that have come here from United Kingdom, what was the motives or intentions for truly coming here? So obviously you have Columbus, in the modern era. I mean, he wasn't the first to find the New World. I mean, I think the Vikings get that credit. I think they still get that credit. But he was the one that kind of Hispaniola, and then the Caribbean, and then but by the time we get to the 16th and 17th century, people have been kind of saying, hey, what's going on over here? What was it all just like, let's rape and pillage, or was it just kind of like, let's try and see what we can do over here and make it our own? Or how do we coordinate? What was I guess, as best we understand, the starting point of the intentions of coming here to the New World, and then did that change at some point, or what was, I guess the original starting line?
Yeah, I think it's difficult to decouple those two things. Let's come over here and let's see what's happening, to rape and pillaging, because there's quite a lot of knowledge by the time the English arrived. There's actually quite a lot of knowledge circulating in Europe about the Americas and the Caribbean, from the Spanish and the Portuguese. But even before sort of formal English colonization, decades of privateering and things like that. And so the English had kind of a good knowledge of well, not necessarily good knowledge, but they had knowledge of the people that lived there, and the sort of ecosystems and the geography, and certainly of the resources. Not entirely accurate. So there was in the 1570s, one of the things that drew Sir Humphrey Gilbert across, who we think of as an explorer, but was intimately bound up with atrocities in Ireland. So I think it's better to think of him as a colonist. Was this Portuguese rumor that there was a kind of land of gold in North America. and that the streets were paved with gold, and it was another sort of gold mine like South America at that time was for the Spanish, and so there was this pool of mineral riches, because we also have to remember that that England is kind of quite an impoverished place at the end of the 16th and into the 17th century. There are food shortages in the reign of Elizabeth that cause kind of riots and uprisings. Its main export, wool or cloth, is depressed and in need of new markets. And there's a lot of poverty and religious persecution and intolerance. And so the kind of pull, in a way, was England trying to compensate for its poverty and its irrelevance, and to kind of look at its European neighbours who were somewhere like Portugal, for example, not a terribly wealthy place before, but once it established itself in North America and West Africa and into Asia, eventually it becomes one of Europe's early superpowers in terms of the wealth it was importing, and so England sort of looks on quite envious, and so it is pulled across the Atlantic early on, mostly on the coattails of the Spanish and Portuguese, because a lot of the privateering raids, such as Francis Drake, is about capturing the wealth that the Spanish are bringing back from the Americas. And so stories of lands of gold, one of the key ways to finance those early voyages to attract investors. So it is about mineral wealth and enriching England. That's part of it, but the other part of it, that they knew it wasn't an empty land. This kind of contemporaneous to the time, this idea that North America was a wild place, and that it was empty. And so when the earliest English colonists arrive, the way they write home about it is that they describe a Garden of Eden, one that's paradise. It's flora and fauna, but there's no mention really of people being there. And the people are there, and the English, when they land, they are landing in quite crowded estuaries full of indigenous American villages, and the sounds and the rivers are crowded with fishing weirs and canoes, and so this is a populated, not populated as heavily as in Europe. Take a place like Carolina, for example, that all of the Carolinas today, North and South Carolina, there's perhaps 15,000 to 20,000 people living on the coastal region. So it's a lightly populated lab, but they knew that people were there. And so then to apply for a charter to colonize, to set up colonies that would extract that wealth and things like that, there is an acceptance that these people will have to be dealt with, and that they would have to be displaced or make room for the English. And so, even if the intention wasn't let's go to America and kill a bunch of indigenous people and take over, the idea of applying for a charter to acquire often like a 700 mile stretch of territory from South Carolina all the way to what today we would sort of say was Massachusetts, that you would know you'd be displacing people. That this was not a Virginia, but it was in fact the Algonquin country of Senecamoco or Osamocomoc. And so, I think those two things are bound up. You can't separate the kind of commercial or mineral intentions of the English to come over and get rich with the fact that to do that you will have to displace people and make some kind of space for yourself. And I think that even if there's no master plan to take over indigenous America, I think that most people were happy to go over there and to force indigenous people to give them food, or to be displaced from the territory that the English coveted. And so I think that in that period of colonialism, when the Spanish and the Portuguese, the Dutch and the English, those two things were that you could not separate them. Even if you say we just want to go there and mine the gold and the minerals, well, that you need indigenous labor, you need a system of exploitation, extraction. Those are colonial processes that will inevitably lead to violence and displacement and things like that.
I guess there's two questions here, which I'm gonna try and remove the moral aspect of it for a minute. So here's my caveat, just in case anybody's confused. So obviously, I think raping and pillaging and displacing and exploiting any people groups is an absolute catastrophe, and I don't think those things should be done anywhere, past or present. Um, I guess from the perspective at the time of the empire, or the British Empire, was two things. So if it's seen from the perspective of the empire, hey, listen, if we don't do this, the Spanish or the Portuguese are, and there are rivals, there are threats, there we have to get a foothold here. I would assume that's part of it. And then second, I mean, if you come to a place, so let's set aside the mineral and the goods, the natural resources, things like that aside for a minute, and you see a vast country or world or place, and it is, I let's say it's this sounds bad, but just for this the comparison here, underdeveloped, for according to them. There's not as, or it's not as developed as maybe what the British were familiar with or home, or there's a lot of potential for development or to own it. I mean, how do we how do we square those things? So like, I don't think any of these white dudes that come from England with, the authority of the monarchy or whatever behind them are going to say, "Well, we came here, it's nice, but there's people living there, and we're going to leave them alone, and we're not going to come back." How do we? I don't think they're, or you know what? Let's try to, create all of these documents and we coexist and live right beside them in a really diverse, equitable, and inclusive way. That is never going to happen. So how do we hold these two things? I guess factually, and I'm trying to stay away from the moral aspect because that makes it all cloudy and murky and stuff. Because obviously it's wrong to do those things, but I think, how do we understand that? I guess historically.
Hmm. I think, it's such a so I understand the question, and I understand why a lot of people would ask it, but I would say that for me, um, it's very difficult to, when you say to understand it historically and not morally. Well, we're humans, and I don't necessarily think you always have to decouple the moralizing perspective. Like you said, we know those things are wrong, but then, what are they supposed to do? Not do it? And it's sort of like, I guess what we need to think about here is what kind of metric are we using? And I think that in that particular period of time, you could loosely describe, and this is what, and you're absolutely right, because this is what the English do, is they kind of devise this metric for how do we understand this Virginia, this virgin land, this paradise that they've stumbled. They call it a paradise. The waters are ravishing, and you see that in real time through the documents that they divide this metric to say, right, how can we excuse what we're about to do? How do we justify our presence here? One of that is through it's in a way the English themselves are sort of spin this narrative that it's purely to attack the Spanish, and colonies like Roanoke in Osamocomoc, which we would understand today as Carolinas, that partly that was financed to thought there to be a privateering base against the Spanish. So there's that sort of justification. This is all part of the kind of inter-European rivalry. But the other one is to say, well, how do we invalidate the claims of the people who live here? And the metrics they devise are exactly the one you just mentioned, this idea of development of the country. So they're coming from what I guess we would describe as a kind of early kind of capitalist mentality of the productivity of the people that live there, the way that the land is being exploited, and the extraction of wealth, and the expansion of agriculture. And if these things are not done, then the people living there have no right and over the land, and therefore the land is not populated. These people, they're here, but they don't own the land. And I think that's a fantastic perspective to understand, because you can see the English literally clawing around for some kind of justification for how do we resist coming in and conquering this place, because look at it, oh my gosh. And so they write back and they say that these people have not developed the land, And I think one of the colonists, John Smith, describes Virginia as a desert. In the early modern sense, deserts were often described as a way to describe unproductive or undeveloped places, not in the kind of sand way we would understand today. And he describes it as a desert that just a handful of Englishmen could cultivate and bring into production. And so when you take that European metric, and you see how utterly that contrasts with the understanding of indigenous people with the land, in which the land was something to live from, but also to live in harmony with. So, somewhere like Ossamakoma, the Carolinas, they were not particularly abundant with food or natural resources. As the English find out, there is no gold there. There's a kind of soft copper that they find particularly invaluable. But the indigenous people, it's not a land of plenty, or there's not a massive bounty, but they just find a way to extract what they need from the land to survive. There's no surplus, there's no kind of wealth in resources. And contrary to what the English say, that, it is developed to an extent. There's agricultural farming, there's fishing weirs, there is some mining, there's manufacturing of certain goods. There are even bridges and paths that have been cleared. The forest is burnt down to cultivate it and to create, a more fertile land in later seasons. So they are engaged with the land and they're exploiting it, but only in the sense of being able to live and survive and have what they need. And so when you understand those two metrics, they're so completely different. One is very kind of exploitative, extractive, capitalist mentality as a way of justifying ownership of the land. And the other one is about, living with the land and engaging with it. A lot of reasons why the English are coming over in the early 17th century is because England's forests have been stripped bare. There's overcrowding and poverty. Vagrancy has become a problem. They've sort of, in a way, exhausted England, having to look elsewhere for their wealth and growth, economic growth. And so you see these two things as kind of completely irreconcilable. And the idea then that why would the English not do it? The other Europeans are doing it. And, if they don't do it, they're going to lose out. That may be true, but I don't think in any kind of way it necessarily removes the fact that was still a very, imperialist colonial mindset, one in which the Algonquin, for example, do not have. They have paramount chiefdoms. So in Virginia, with perhaps kind of imperial ambitions to dominate surrounding tribes. But even then, that relationship is often based more on kinship and vassalage than it is on hegemony or dominance or exploitation. And so I just think it's a kind of completely like a quantum leap in understanding where these different groups are coming from. And so what kind of makes me cringe a little bit is when some people sort of say, well, it's a kind of clash of civilizations. Well, it's okay. We could describe a lot of situations like that, and I think that they wouldn't suit our traditional narratives. You wouldn't describe Nazi Germany and the fight as a clash of, because they're different value systems and different systems to understand the land. If you think about Hitler's policies towards Eastern Europe and Russia, this idea of living space, and so there's also increasingly a racial component of this. And a good example is the early accounts of indigenous American people, the Algonquin of the East Coast, is that you get this obsession by Europeans of recording the bodies of indigenous people and the colour of their skin and their hair and their shape, and it's like it permeates a lot of the early accounts, and you just think, come on, get on with it. And but they're obsessed with trying to, and so again, you've got to see in real time that I tend to kind of racialize these groups and understand the difference between themselves and them, and in doing so, that allows them to justify, well, why can't we come in and take it? There's
a type of othering there that's going on.
There is a type of othering. Now, I don't think it's as prominent early on in the late 16th, early 17th century. It's much more prominent in the 18th century, especially with large-scale transatlantic slavery. But even early on, even in Ireland, Elizabeth calls one of the prominent Irish chiefs her Black Irishman. So it's this kind of othering, this distinction between the English that allows them to justify their behaviour. So I understand your question. If you kind of strip the morality of it, what are the English not supposed to conquer these places? But I don't necessarily think you should decouple the morality of
No,
it.
no, no, no.
And
I don't think you should. No, I don't think you should. I only for organizational sake of
of
trying to
course,
talk
but
about
then
all
that,
of
in
them
a
at the
way, I
same time.
think, in a sense, doesn't allow us to understand the different values and the cultures of these people, because for example, in Ireland, which is a heavily populated, there's something perhaps over 1 million people in Ireland at the time of the Elizabethan conquest. And a lot of the English who earlier went to Ireland had actually converted to Gaelic Irish culture and adopted Irish names and fashion and married Irish men and women, and necessarily don't see themselves as culturally superior. So even in this densely populated land with established kingdoms and systems, the English still turn up and conquer and displace people and disenfranchise them and exploit them. And so in many ways, it's very similar to what's going on in America. And I think that you have to understand within this colonial mindset of hegemony or dominance and exploitation. And I don't. So whilst the kind of comparison with, well, other Europeans might do it as well, that doesn't work in Ireland, for example. It does, and I think another way to put this in context, if you look in places like Asia or the Mediterranean, where there are the early modern world superpowers, the Mughal Empire in India, the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean, North Africa, and you suddenly see the English, a very different dynamic where they're very constrained and they have to behave themselves and be very careful about. Yeah, very different. And so I think it's also a question of power as well, empowering. But in the Atlantic, in North America and the Caribbean, the English see themselves as more powerful and able to pursue their ambitious policies for exploitation and colonization. The only thing that stops them in places like Asia and Mediterranean is that they can't. Then when they try it, they get a swift wallop. Yeah. So yeah, it's an interesting question, and I understand the framing, but I think that the framing doesn't necessarily help if we strip back and say, let's just historicize it. Well, to historicize it, you have to understand the different value systems of these people.
I totally agree with what you're saying. I have the hard thing I have with this. Well, there's this concept I think of sovereignty, right? Of essentially, it's not who gets here first, and then you that you're the winner, right? I don't think it's entirely that. Maybe there's some bit of that, but I think that for thousands of years, you had, if you go all the way back to when folks, walked across the Bering Strait, as the story goes, and folks came, here to the Americas, North, Central, and South America, and the Caribbean. They had been inhabiting this continent for thousands of years. That's. I mean, I think if you have this idea of sovereignty, I think they have it for for sure. And I think I mean, the hard thing about this is that it's two things, I guess, again at the same time. Of I think morally, so what you're saying is it's true. I don't think we should strip the moral aspect of it. Things are wrong when they're wrong. It doesn't matter necessarily of when it's wrong. It's important, the context and time, but I think you can look at any civilization. You can look at the Sumerians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Egyptians, the Romans, so on and so forth. We've been doing this to each other as a human race for millennia. So that's true. Obviously, it looks different, kind of what you're saying with the Mongol Empire, and how they did things was very different than how indigenous folks did things here for thousands of years. But to me, that just shows the diversity of humans. That just shows and contextualized within their terrain. So in the steppe, in the Silk Roads, all those things, right? It's much different than the wild and wonderful Americas, whatever you want to describe it. And I think that's, in my view, it's hard, right? Because it's like, how do you hold people in the 17th century to a standard in that I have in the 21st century or other people do? And I don't think you can or should, But I think you have to understand. I guess it's an interesting question. I don't have an answer to it. Of how do you have this humanity throughout time? We understand what it means to be human.
Yeah.
We've obviously had people since the Greeks and even before that have thought about what it means. If you go back to obviously various religious literature that's showing like love your neighbor and 10 commandments and various things from the Talmud and even things from other Mesopotamian kind of, like we have ways of trying to be kind to fellow humans. And I wonder, at least on that ground, right? Because I think that it's in trying to be fair to everybody involved at the time, people only know what they know, right? At the time. Like you can't hold someone accountable to things they don't know or advancements in science and, philosophy and thinking. But I think the humanity of people at any point, people know, hey, if I'm raping somebody or if I'm beating somebody, that's not an okay thing to do, regardless of what you're doing it, whatever religion, whatever God, whatever empire, whatever name you're doing it in. And I wonder if we hold the British that come here to the New World to that standard at the least. I wonder if it would be to say, hey, listen, like you have to make attempts. You must at the moral human good to say, why don't you try to cohabitate with folks here? Why don't you try to live with them, have certain ways of ruling, respecting their kind of sovereignty they have? I think those things at the least or bare minimum would be fair for people at that time. What do you think in terms of the
I think,
moral piece?
Yeah, so the argument you're sort of laying out, or the perspective, is quite a popular one, and I think that this idea of presentism, this projecting the present on the past as a way of understanding it, which. So, I mean, a few things I would say, especially in the context of understanding the British Empire, is that the values we hold high today and things we would regard as being bad, etc., were not absent in the past. And so, if you look at, let's give the context of North America. So when the English arrive in Virginia, for example, Seneca Moco is that the paramount chiefdom of the Powhatans, which was the main territorial, political, cultural power in North America at the time. And these foreigners, they regard them as quite smelly and funny-looking foreigners, come and land in present Jamestown on the James River. Then Wahun Sanaka, who is the paramount chief, invites them and establishes trading links and welcomes them. Says, "Come move near my capital, and if you provide me with certain goods, then I will look after you." And he considers them his 31st tribe, and this guy John Smith, or John Smith as he calls him, is seen as now chief of the English tribe. And so there's a tendency, and that happens in New England as well. The establishment of the Connecticut and the Massachusetts and the Plymouth colonies is that Indigenous Americans, the Wampanoags or the Narragansetts, they tend to try and incorporate the English into their existing networks of vassalage and trade. And that seems to be the default approach that they have. And so what happens, certainly in Virginia with the Powhatans, is the English immediately fight back against their, this sort of attempt to create this cross-cultural connection with the English. And so within sort of a year and a half, they try to reverse that vassalage, and they try and forcefully crown Wahun Sanaka with an English crown and scepter that's been sent out to make him a king of James I in England and an English vassal. They start to attack nearby villages and tribes for food. The English are starving. They've brought over a bunch of mineralogists rather than farmers to actually cultivate the land and sustain a colony. And so very almost immediately the English turn that rather kind of open and diplomatic and amiable relationship on its head, and instead replace that with violence and coercion and exploitation. And so and then begins the first Anglo-Powhatan War. And so and the English often know that what they're doing is wrong by their current standards. And there's not. It's not like what are we doing? This is how we do it in the 17th century.
Yeah.
One, because the resistance of the indigenous people tell them that what they're doing is wrong, and so, but also there are contemporary English people at the time that say, "Oh my, this is wrong. We shouldn't be behaving like this." So I've always been a slightly suspect of us saying, "Well, projecting our values." Well, no, because indigenous people have always cherished their lives, and they've always not wanting their villages to be burnt down or to be displaced from the land. And so these are not modern values. And so a really good example, again, go back to Ireland, which is happening at the same time as Virginia and elsewhere, is that one of the tactics the English use when they're frustrated they can't achieve a victory against Hugh O'Neill, who's the Earl of Tyrone in Ulster in North Ireland. He's achieved a stunning victory against the English at the Battle of Yellowford, shattered the English presence, but he's really evasive, and the English find it difficult to engage with him after. And so one of the things they do is we'll inflict atrocities on the civilian population and create a famine that will eventually force those chiefs and lords to submit to the English because their families and their subjects are dying. And so this guy, Lord Mountjoy, sets about to engineer a human engineered famine, I should say. And very quickly, thousands of people start dropping dead. There's these terrible descriptions of peasants coming out of the forest, like anatomies of death is the words that the English use. And there's one colonial official writes out and says, "This is completely wrong. This is unbecoming of Christians. This is against all the laws of nature. We shouldn't be doing this." And so. And also, I think that so we have lots of written accounts of people saying at the time, "This is not, this is immoral. We shouldn't be doing this." The other one, and then there's the obvious, resistance to what the English are doing by non-European indigenous people, which should very obviously tell the English that what they're doing is immoral. But there's also the fact that. And I think this is very important. The English constantly try to justify their actions. Now, if you don't think you're doing anything wrong, why would you try and justify that action?
Sure.
So,
of course.
some of the accounts we get are so hilariously contrived, and they're often called out by domestic, people in London or the king or the ministers, and we get when we unpick these narratives that are spun by people on the spot who have done these terrible things. If they quickly they're tying themselves in knots to try and shift blame and to create a narrative in which indigenous people are at fault. And so it's very clear that at the time there's quite widespread consensus that yes, going over to a different country, displacing the people, that it has to be justified, that it also has to be covered up, that it's that the resistance itself is sign enough that what you're doing is not by the standards of the day. And the fact that a lot of English people at the time also condemn it. And that the same is, so the big topic for this kind of framing is, people have always been doing this and we shouldn't judge them by today's standards, is that I think the trade in enslaved people is a really good example. And that's the one that it becomes really contested, I think, amongst people. So there's always been slavery throughout history. We don't think slavery is good today, but everyone enslaved people at the time. It wasn't just Britain, it's all the other Europeans that were doing it. And it was, African chiefs that were enslaving their own people and selling to Europeans. That's absolutely true. Slavery is not an invention of Europeans. Racial slavery is, of course, and the size and the intensity and the industrialization of slavery under Europeans is unique. But slavery itself is not unique. And so that's the kind of argument we have. And I would say to that, and people say, that was the values of the day, and why should we judge people back then? And when we threw the statue of Edward Colston, who was the director of the Royal African Company, into Bristol Harbour a couple of years back, there's this outcry, you can't pull our history down. Well, first of all, statues are not history; they commemorate, and often done by later.
We have the same. We have the same.
Of course
argument
you do.
over here.
I know, absolutely. And the thing is, I would say to that is the idea that there were no people that thought slavery was wrong, or I can think of 12.5 million people at the time, the enslaved who resisted slavery, who escaped slavery, who died in slavery, who opposed slavery. And so when we say things like we can't project our current laws onto the Europeans that did those things, what we're saying is that that the only morality that was legitimate back then was European morality and the way they moralized what they were doing. But actually, if you just shift to, which the book hopefully does, shift to indigenous or non-European people who those things were happening to, very quickly realize that, well, their values, their morals was not to be conquered, not to be exploited, not to be displaced, and not to be slaughtered. And so why should their moral objections not count? And so I think that, yes, I understand that framing. It's a popular one, but I think also in a way it's kind of the kind of regurgitation of kind of British attempts to justify, and that come down to us from the Victorians who used it for their forefathers, and then in the 20th century it's very popular. But I think historians have just become a little bit more critical of that why should the resistance of people who were enslaved, why did that not count as contemporary morals? And that's not we haven't invented that slavery is bad. A lot of people back then. So I think it's an interesting one. But I don't necessarily think it holds up terribly well for especially the study of the British Empire. And the other thing is, yes, that all empires, non-European and indigenous, you're engaged in things like slavery. But as a scholar of the British Empire, sadly, I can only sort of talk. I know people say, well, what about the Mongol Empire? And I'm like, I have no idea. I'll have to Wikipedia that. I can't tell you. What I can tell you about this of the British Empire, and I have, honestly, I've tried in this book to hopefully to make, I talk a lot about the Portuguese and the Spanish and the Dutch and what they were doing as well. And,
yeah, you do. Yeah.
And talking about slavery, I put the spotlight on the Dahomean slave traders, the West African slave traders. Yeah. But again, a bit like what you said at the very beginning, those two things can be true at the same time. Other people can be doing it. It could be just an age-long human trait, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there was no resistance to it and that it was not morally, reprehensible. Yeah, that's a very long answer. Sorry, I'm hijacked.
No, it's great. It's great.
Strong feelings again, a bit like the coronation. You've
No, I want to just to be clear. One of the things I really enjoy about the conversation is I don't hear a lot of conversations in this way often. And that's not trying to give myself a compliment. I'm trying to sort of, in a way, be a conduit for some of these types of things, because I perfectly agree with everything you're saying, and I think that that's important. And I, while you were giving your answer, I was thinking about, really, it's, of course, people felt and knew that enslaving people and pillaging places is wrong. And the people that were on the receiving end of that, their morals were like, this is really wrong. But it really does come down to power. Who has power at the time.
Yes.
And there is obviously a perpetual and an institutional abuse of power, of course. I'm sure you can find, again, I'm not a world historian or anything like that, but examples of various communities or cultures or kingdoms or empires, maybe, I don't know, that aren't doing this at scale, or they're not doing this for their entire existence, or that they did it and then they corrected for it and then they tried not to, or something. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I think the thing about that is that even for people in the British Empire, right, at the time, we're probably like, hey, this is terrible, we shouldn't do this, let's not do that. And there's nothing they can do about it. It reminds me a little bit, again, as a former colonist state, we have a younger history. So, but it reminds me of like all the abolitionists in the 1840s and 50s, where they were just like, look, this is terrible. This is immoral. This is inhumane. We cannot keep adding states into our union with slavery in it. We have to eradicate this. We have to, and again, people do the same thing. Well, at the time, that's how it was. That was part of our economy. That's what, and it's like, that's a terrible thing. That's a terrible thing to say. This is how it is. And, and I think that doesn't make necessarily like who's on the right side or the wrong side of history per se. I find those arguments a little pedestrian, but I mean, I get the point of it, but it is one of those things where it's like, this is always wrong, and people at the time were saying, hey, this is wrong. Now, they may have been a minority voice, or maybe people didn't hear them. And I think there was widespread abolitionism in the country at the time, right? Pre-Civil War, which pushed and moved. I think they were seen as extremists, but they pushed and moved a lot of the stuff to get, Reconstruction afterwards, et cetera. And it's just one of those things where it's like, when you're talking about the British Empire, it's so interesting how people have kind of, maybe it's just the proper way of the British or something. I don't know, but it's having this kind of sort of reckoning of things. And it's interesting how in the United States, as former colonists, we ended up doing the same things. We ended up being imperialists and being, colonizing the same way. And it's interesting how, well, we come from that, and we didn't want to do that, but then we just did that to other people and in different, island states around the world and other places. And it's like, well, we're just doing the same thing we tried to get freedom from. We're making the same mistakes. I mean, it's odd.
And so, when you take into, which is why I think that, histories of the United States, when written by indigenous scholars, for example, you asked a question early on, I realized I didn't answer part of it, is that, when you have Euro-Americans, or I should say white Americans or Europeans writing about the history of the United States or European empires, it's a very different history from one written by indigenous people. Or so, for one of the great things about scholarship of the British Empire is, from the sort of 70s onwards, we had post-colonial scholarship, which changed a lot of the way we understand history. This is scholarship written by people from recently independent countries, especially India, that then started to lead the way on. And these were the very first histories where suddenly we're like, were we the bad guys? Oh my God. And it's because, it's first, finally we have a different perspective. And that's why those contributions are so rich. And one of the big kind of challenges that I had writing this is, I'm another white guy from Britain trying to tell the history of the British Empire that isn't just from a British perspective, but how can I, ever really try and do that? And as a specialist of the British Empire, I like to think I have a contribution to make, but will it ever be as authentic or comprehensive than if it was written by someone from the global south, for example, who very rarely have the opportunity to write these histories because, the state of academia or the resources they have, the privilege we have in places like the United States and Europe is that, we can dedicate time. This took me sort of all told in about 4.5 years to write. A lot of that was just me for 3 years writing and reading. And that's such an indulgent and wonderful opportunity that I had. But I know that just because I had that doesn't mean this is, the only perspective in history of that. So I think that when we incorporate those kind of non-white, non-European American voices into conversation, it's almost like, wow, this is a totally different history. And it's just, it's like in any situation in life, when we get a different perspective on something that we thought we knew, it completely changes how we appreciate things. So I think, I always think about white abolitionism, was wonderful, and it was great pressure that helped to, eventually abolish slavery. But what if those enslaved people? And I could think of at least a dozen slave rebellions in the pre-Civil War period, which would have said to everyone, what you're doing is wrong because look, you're done. But and I think what would enslaved people have done that reverses that entirely? I just think about like the narrative around the British abolition of the slave trade, which is seen as this triumphant moment, again a rehabilitating story of the British Empire. And you cannot find a politician that, if asked about the British Empire, won't go, well, of course it abolished slavery and it built the railways. And you think, well, actually, the first people to abolish slavery was in Haiti when that became independent of France. The first thing it did, a couple of years before Britain, is abolish slavery. The moment, indigenous non-European or enslaved people were able to shape the story, they did, the opposite to what Europeans did. And I just think how interesting or how different our understanding of all of this would be if they had been the prominent voices that they'd written the histories that have come down to us. And so what we're doing, I guess, now is we're deconstructing centuries-long entrenched European and Anglo-American histories of these things. And so I just think that, those voices have always been there. Slave uprisings and indigenous atrocities to indigenous and non-European people. and so they are the really authentic voices. Now they very rarely leave written records and the histories we don't have, but we should be making every effort still to switch that perspective. I think that will change how we understand contemporary values and this idea of presentism will just kind of evaporate, I think. So but it's just it just pulls in so many different feelings and perspectives, and I don't think that process will ever be uncontested. Because
I totally agree with you. I mean, we have a handful of indigenous scholars now writing books and publishing here in the United States, which is wonderful to see. I had somebody on the podcast a little while ago. She's a historian, Megan Kate Nelson, and she wrote this book called the three. Let me butcher the title name. The Three-Cornered War, I think is what it's called, and great book. I think it was a finalist for the Pulitzer here, and she tells the story of the Civil War in the West, right? So New Mexico, Colorado, West Texas, Arizona, all that, which doesn't in general get talked about as much. It's always, here on the East Coast, east of the Mississippi River, it's all that stuff, which is, a lot of prominent battles were there and stuff, but not as spotlighted the Western theater, if you will. And the really cool thing about the book is she talks about the Union, right? The good guys, right? And then the Confederates, the bad guys, right? And we need those narratives. But the interesting thing is that she talks about Native peoples and how there was, hence the Three-Cornered War. Not all Native peoples really cared about the war that we were having. And so then they get pulled into it and they're fighting on different sides and it becomes very convoluted out in the West. A story I never knew. Never knew that story. Never knew how I didn't even know all the stuff that happened in the traditional narrative of the Civil War in the West, much less incorporating how that was with Native peoples, and she kind of gives an epilogue of the kind of the afters. And so but the point I'm bringing that up is we need more stories like that, but B, reading reviews or comments or whatever. Of course, she was nominated for a Pulitzer. People loved it. I loved it. A lot of great people loved it. Oh, she got a lot of hate for it though.
I'm sure she
did. Lot of pushback for it, and it was like, why? Yeah. Why? Because you're just telling a story with more than your traditional narrative. It's not making up something that didn't happen. It's just telling a story we don't usually hear that's just as valuable as anything else. I don't know why you wouldn't tell that. It's like watching 3/4 of a movie and not watching the end of it. It's like you got to watch all the parts. I don't understand why people resist that.
I mean, I suspect that this is always the case that also she's a woman, and is she indigenous?
No, that's my knowledge.
Okay, but just the fact that she's women always come in, revisionist historians when they're women, they always come in for that kind of a challenge. But I think just anyone who what they're essentially is enriching a story that we already know and providing it with a more comprehensive scope. But it's what we said earlier. You're then complicating a cherished, simplistic narrative, and that's seen as a threat to a whole group of people in society that I'm not even going to start talking about. But whether they're representative or whether it's a very vocal minority, it's interesting. But that and so why wouldn't you tell all the threads of a story?
Right?
Saying to me.
Me too. I don't understand it. So it's nice hearing those different parts. I don't hear that part. I just always get the same kind of stuff. So real quick, I guess I want to obviously be respectful of your time. So in the last minutes that we have, we can maybe split the rest of the time into just kind of the second parts, the part 2 and 3 of the book. So in the second part of the book, you talk about the British Empire and how it's a little bit different when they get to India, when they get to you have the Ottoman Empire, you have all of these in I guess Eurasia or Asia, totally different than how it was in Ireland, in the Americas, in the Caribbean. I guess thematically, and you can just pull from different things here. Obviously, as you mentioned, you have the Spanish and the Dutch that were roaming around there, and there was a lot of competition there in Asia. Obviously, you have the East India Company. I'm sure you know and have read Dalrymple and all of his quartets. Yeah, when he
Yeah,
was on the podcast, he is an absolutely lovely man.
he is.
He's very
Yeah.
brilliant. Anyways, so yeah, just you can pull from all these things from the Ottomans. Ottomans are it was a 600-year empire. It's amazing. It was fascinating empire. Um, anyways, what can you say about the British in this
Yeah.
part of the world
Mm.
and how they handled some of the dynamics from competition or other empires?
Yeah. So, what I think is really interesting when the story shifts, not necessarily chronologically later, these things are often happening at the same time. The East India Company launched in 1600,
Right.
establishes its first kind of trading post in 1603. They're not even in Virginia yet in 1603. Colonization of the Caribbean doesn't happen in 1620. So these things are, happening at the same time, which I always finds quite interesting. But and so when they go to Asia, they find very different systems. Asia is essentially the kind of center of the world, really, at this period. And obviously, it's quite cyclical. And this is we're coming back to that in a way, economically, culturally, and militarily. The Mughal Empire on the Indian subcontinent commands 125 million people, 20% of the world's GDP. Its Indo-Persian culture spreads across the world, fabulous architecture, and so centers of Islamic learning, and it just makes England on the northwest tip of Europe look this kind of drab and unsophisticated. And so for when the English arrive, the hatmen, as they're often called, for the long hats they wear, they look down upon, this completely insignificant. They offer no goods that anyone in Asia wants. The prime export of England is wool. People in Southeast Asia, 40 degrees, they don't want woolly jumpers. Even at Christmas, we always wear woolly jumpers, but no one they're draped in Chinese silk and sumptuous Indian cotton textiles. And so the English struggle to establish themselves commercially. It's a very sophisticated commercial system. The rivals of the English, yes, they're to an extent the Dutch and Portuguese, but the real rivals are the Chinese. Chinese merchants. The Chinese diaspora is entrenched in every port in Asia. China, just before the European arrival, China was the dominant economic and political power. And for a long time, its vassalage system, its tributary system made it the center of everything. In the Ming and then later the Qing Empire kind of withdraws from the outside world slightly, but the Chinese communities that are already established remain, and they create this very sophisticated trading system. Chinese goods are the goods that are really in demand across Asia, not English woolens and porcelain, lacquer goods, raw silk, and the English just cannot compete. And so they fail to crack the spice trade on the island of Java in today's Indonesia, and then they try it and they go to Japan, and they open up a trading post there in 1613 onwards. And again, they found the Chinese are more sophisticated. The Tokugawa shogunate, the Japanese state, is very centralized, very regulated. It has a bureaucracy, the Bakufu military government, that is so vast and complex. It regulates it's very much like a modern bureaucracy. At the time in England, there was perhaps 1,200, mostly part-time, kind of civil servants, very small bureaucracy. And so, Japan is so centralized and everything is so regulated. The English struggle to maintain their presence. And then when they start to kind of commit piracy to get what they want rather than trade, they're quickly expelled from Japan. And so it's a kind of catalogue of failures. Suddenly they're thrust into this, the epicenter of power in the world, and the English just can't compete. And so they get their first success in India, in Mughal India, not because they're able to outcompete people or to assert any kind of or project any kind of power, but they gradually learn to play by Mughal rules and to do as they're told and to adapt to the situation. They acquire a kind of trading charter a trade deal, I guess it's called a farman. An imperial decree from the Mughal emperor allows them to trade in India as long as they behave themselves. And one of the things the Mughals are so sophisticated at doing with these Europeans that arrive on their doorstep is kind of playing them off one against another. And the English are pitted against the Portuguese, and the Mughals sort of watch on as the Portuguese and the English kind of shred each other apart. And the English emerge victorious, so they're given a seat at the Mughal table and they become a key trading partner. And so it's very different in these highly regulated, centralized, very wealthy and populous empires of Asia and the Middle East, where the English have to adapt and work within these powerful structures. In North America and the Caribbean, they pull down those existing kingdoms and economic structures and replace them.
I wonder, when I was reading this part of the book and I was thinking about this, I always wonder, again, it's just different around the world, but I wonder if there was, if indigenous peoples and tribes here in the all up and down the Americas and the Caribbean, if they had something like that, like it was in Asia, again, totally different histories, totally different, landscapes, but something analogous to that, would it have been different?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think that's a good question. And we do see sophisticated empires, and especially in Mesoamerica with the Spanish and the Aztecs, and they're quite easily overwhelmed. In islands, the Irish kingdoms are quite powerful. The Earl of Tyrone has a revenue equals Queen Elizabeth's and a modern army, and so you do see established policies, not on the scale of the Ottoman Empire that is across 4 continents and can field a fleet of 200 warships and an army 100,000, or the Mughal Empire in the Indo-Gangetic heartland, 120 million people. Nothing like that. And the English do across the 17th century spar with the Mughal Empire, for example, and each time they're kind of squatted away. And there's a war in Bengal in eastern India, and it's not so much a war as the English sort of being chased out and having to come back and sort of beg for forgiveness. And so and even with the sort of powerful polities and states in the Americas and around the Atlantic Rim, there's nothing quite comparable. So it's difficult to say. Yeah. But what I would say is it's not necessarily, and I think there's something I overly make clear in the book, is that even in those places like, the Caribbean, where the English are successful and they do virtually destroy the Kalinago indigenous people, that process still takes over a century. And it's still, for most of that period that we think of the English colonized the Caribbean, actually the Caribbean is half colonized and it's partitioned virtually with the indigenous people who are very effective at resisting. So even there, that it's not quite the English come in and conquer. There's a very protracted struggle that the English are not always, and in Ireland it takes hundreds and hundreds of years to happen. So it's not quite a comparison of easy in the Atlantic, difficult in Asia, but the imbalance of power is staggering, and you don't find that in the Atlantic and the Asia. And I think that it probably would have been a different story had you had something like the Ottoman Empire in North America. So, but the other thing is the English state is very weak in this period. It's very difficult to project its power overseas. Its successor, the British state, with the union with England and Scotland, becomes far more effective and capable. But England in the 17th century, its idea of projecting power against the Mughal Empire, it sends 3 ships and 400 guys to take it on, and so it's a bit of a laugh. But it's in North America and the Caribbean, it has the massive advantage of overwhelming immigration from Europe. And so even the most resilient and powerful of the indigenous polities, the Powhatan chiefdom, or even the Kalinago, who militarily are very effective, are just completely overwhelmed by a human tidal wave. And if you think about the islands of the Caribbean, these specks, these, the top of these sunken volcanoes, 70 square miles or so, there's 40,000 Europeans living on those tiny islands by the end of the 17th century. There's 250,000 Europeans in America by the end of the 17th century. There's no comparable English immigration to the Ottoman Empire or the Mughal Empire. And so yes, the English are able to project their power better in the Caribbean, North America, but much of their success just comes from this tidal wave of human colonization. That by the 15,000 Powhatans in the beginning of the 17th century, within 30 years, are outnumbered 2-1 by Europeans, and the Powhatans orchestrate this attack on the English that decimates a third of the English population. And within a year and a half, that number has been recuperated, twofold. And so that's the struggle there, is I think mass immigration of Europeans into the Caribbean doesn't happen in Asia or the Mediterranean. And then, so maybe we could look at that, and had that been a different story if there was a stronger English presence in there. But no, without a doubt, once they get to Asia, that if they don't play by Mughal or Ottoman rules, then simply that their trade doesn't thrive. It only begins to grow at the end of the 17th century when, they learn to be good vassals, essentially. They're vassals of the Mughal emperor and the Ottoman sultan. Yeah. So, I think different dynamic, absolutely. And that's why I think it's important as well. We just don't look at this story from London or from the perspective of Britain, because a lot of it is dependent on the local context and the differences between these regions. So what happens on the island of Java is totally different to what happens in Ireland. And it isn't always just, and that tells us where agency lies as well. It just doesn't lie with the Europeans necessarily. It lies with those very robust and dynamic structures and people that they encounter there.
Yeah. So real quick, just tell us about when you get to Africa. Again, it's the third part of the book. You talk about you mentioned earlier the Royal African Company. You talk about the Dahomean conquests off the Atlantic coast. Obviously, there's products that were very prized. There was slavery here. Just kind of talk about, just thematically real quick, about some of the role of the British Empire in Africa.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting. I wanted to tackle the trade in enslaved people just because it saturates every level of the British Empire. Even in places like Asia, which we don't associate with slavery, the East India Company is involved in slave trade, and at one point it's enslaving so many children that the Mughal Empire steps in and bans them from doing so. And so slavery, like it does all European empires and all empires at the time, the Ottoman as well. And so what I want to do is to and so we think that a region like West Africa, that until recently has been reduced almost like North America in the story of the British Empire, is that just America's this kind of wilderness with indigenous people essentially killed off by disease and stuff. Or actually, no, there's thriving and powerful polities that resist the English. In West Africa, it's not just a place of slavery. There are sophisticated, flourishing kingdoms and communities there. And I want to shed light on that sophistication. There are highly centralized and monetized and militarized states that are, for some British observers, when they get to places like Dahomey, which is a kingdom in West Africa, that they say, I've never seen the like in all my life. These powerful armies, and this king of Dahomey has 12 palaces, and his cupboards are full of the riches of Europe. And they go there not for slaves initially, but the Portuguese and then the Dutch and English arrive there for cloth. Some of the richest and most luxurious cloth can be found produced in West Africa. West African products were found on the beds of England in the Stuart period, covers and salt cellars, salt shakers, and so West Africa itself was a place of wealth and production and sophisticated culture with large cities and established trade networks. And so I wanted to bring that to the fore, then to show how when the English arrive and they eventually become the leading trader in enslaved Africans by the end of the 17th, early 18th century, when their plantation colonies in the Americas take off, is that, again, it's not just the Europeans coming here and taking over and taking slaves away, but it's a far more complicated picture of, African power, and the Africans were not just victims of the British Empire, but they themselves, could adopt a position of power and control. And so whilst still shedding light on, the size of the trade enslaved Africans and the immense suffering of West Africans, West Africans were victims, probably the largest victims in history, 12.5 million people trafficked across the Atlantic. Nonetheless, there are still stories of West African power. And so I thought the expansion of the Kingdom of Dahomey told that really well, in which the states on the Atlantic coast that were dealing with slavery before the expansion of Dahomey were reduced to European puppets almost, and European influence. They could depose kings and put whomever they want on their throne that would supply them with slaves. When Dahomey comes along, it's a very centralized, militarized state. It gains control of the trade and regulates it and forces Europeans to play by their rules. They set prices. They force Europeans to exchange them only certain kinds of goods. When Europeans, engage in political Machiavellian schemes, they are, their factories, their posts are destroyed. Sometimes they're beheaded and enslaved. And so by the mid 18th century, there is a trade in enslaved Africans, of course, and the British still lead, but now regulated by an African kingdom that derives immense benefit from that relationship. And so it was a good example, even in the twilight of the early modern period, the pre-modern age, the 18th century, by the 19th century with industrialization and things like that, we tend to enter the modern period. But in the 18th century, when we think of the kind of the dominance of Europeans, even then states are emerging that are able to take control, to reshape commercial relationships and the relationship between Europeans and indigenous people, and to set the terms of that, and for the British to again kind of accommodate. So West Africa is an interesting position in this narrative because it's not quite part of the Atlantic history that we assume with the Caribbean, North America. It's not quite, it doesn't sit brilliantly with Asia or the Mediterranean. It's kind of its own unique region. And one we always just reduce to this idea of slavery. And while slavery is important, it's not the only history of West Africa. And it's one of immense resilience and power that they could often command over Europeans. Now, that doesn't lessen their role in the trade in enslaved people. West African elites derived immense benefit from that trade, but they could also control it. They weren't powerless themselves. And I thought that was also another important story that doesn't negate what we know, but perhaps adds an extra dimension to it.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. It was a fascinating part of the book to read because, again, this is not something I know a whole lot about, and it was absolutely wonderful to see like all the like complexity there, and again, we get the kind of one-dimensional kind of story here, and again, it's not to say it's not true, but there's a lot going on.
Yeah.
So I guess the last question I have here is that you've written this book not necessarily to show how awful the British Empire was, although there's terrible things about it, like there is with any empire, but to have a more robust view of the stories we don't hear. So it's kind of going back to what we started with. I guess what's the final thing you want to say here on this, on how do you want people to receive your book and to receive it most accurately so that what you were trying to say really gets home to people, where you can say, yeah, that's exactly what I was trying to say.
So what I would hope is that in telling a history of the resilience and power of non-European and indigenous people in this period, is about saying something about the legacy of the British Empire today. And so I think a lot of our misconceptions and ideas around race and international order and inequality and imperialism kind of derives from a lot of the misconceptions about the early modern period and the emergence of the British Empire. And I think if we reduce this idea that Britain sort of conquered and steamrolled over the world and reshaped it in its modern image, then we are going to bring out of that a lot of misconceptions about Western superiority and adopt a lot of, or regurgitate a lot of those stereotypes about non-European people. And so in trying to recenter the history or the story on very powerful, very successful indigenous and non-European people and their societies and their states, I wanted to show that, yes, they were victims of British imperialism and colonialism, often on a horrific scale, and the book gives that's appropriate attention and focus. As you said, it does show the atrocities of the British Empire and the horrors visited upon non-European indigenous people, but it also shows them to be more than just victims. They were capable of containing British ambition. They were capable of taking the British on, sometimes succeeding. You take a map of the British Empire at its height, there are massive parts that aren't covered in imperial pink, and you think, well, were the English not interested? Yes, but they just didn't succeed. They were beaten out. And sometimes the resistance was intergenerational and took centuries. And so it tells us that these societies were not just passive victims, unable to contest their fate, that they were resilient, often successful. And therefore, I think that changes our understanding of the pre-modern world as one that wasn't, as the British at the time like to stereotype as simple, uncivilized, or backward. It's just that when Britain conquered that after 3 centuries, a constellation of diverse and dynamic states and people, that it rewrote that history. That that West Africa was a place where children were sold for pots and pans, that North America was a wilderness whose people were killed off by disease, or that Asia was mired in despotism and heathenism. These are British stories. These are stories of colonialists. And I think that by showing that these cultures were diverse and sophisticated, that their economies were flourishing, and that their political and military history was successful and powerful, then I think it helps to contextualize the British and the British Empire, and to give those states and cultures that are now independent of the British Empire and achieve their independence, gives them a kind of a more empowering history to draw upon. That their ancestors were not passive victims, that there are stories of success and triumph and power in a relationship we've always understood as be a massive imbalance of power that veered towards the modern, technologically superior, culturally superior British. That's just not sustainable if we switch the perspective of that narrative.
Yeah, no, that's very well said. The book is called The Great Defiance: How the World Took on the British Empire. This is out May 25th in the UK. It's through Ebury Press, part of Penguin Random House UK. Does this have a US date? I don't think it does.
This is what, sorry?
Does this have a US date?
It doesn't at the moment. It's available through certain UK suppliers like Foyle's Books, but the US date is still being figured out. So watch this space.
Yeah. I would say one of the wonderful things is that David was so nice to send me his book. So I've read it and it's fabulous. So for American listeners, you'll have to listen to his podcast and get it directly from the UK until it comes out in the US. For all of my listeners across the pond, you can pick it up on the 25th of May, which is it's really fantastic. Where's the best place to find yourself, whether online or any other places professionally? Where's the best place to get at you?
Find me on Twitter. I'm terrible on Twitter, as in the fact that I'm always on it. Or visit the University of Bangor website to see more about my research and publications as well.
No, great. Look, David, this was an absolutely wonderful conversation. I really, really enjoy myself. Really, really a lot of depth there on a lot of important topics. I'm so pleased with the conversation. It was a real delight. I can't say enough thanks.
Yeah, me too. Absolutely. Really enjoyable. Thank you. It's been really exciting to talk about the book. And I'm glad that the kind of issues it threw up was exactly the reason I wrote the book. So I'm glad that they chimed in. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.